The criteria are divided into basically criterion A, B, C, and D, as well as E, F, G, H, and there's 2 specifications as well. So I want to go through that with you. Wow, that's a lot of alphabet. A through F, A through F. No, I'm sorry, that's not even right. A through H, A through H, A through H. Wow, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. 8. All right, and 2 specifications. So let's talk about this. Criterion A, you only need one of these to meet the diagnostic criteria for the A group. And this has to do with your actual exposure to the triggering event. So as I mentioned on the last video, as you can see, it doesn't have to be direct exposure. That's one of the many ways in criterion A you could meet the A criteria of exposure for the triggering event. The person was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence in the following way. It could be directly, these things happen to you. Witnessing, so vicariously, right? You're watching it happen to someone else. It could even be things like learning, getting information that a relative or close friend was exposed to a trauma. You don't even have to be witnessing it. You could also have learned about the event from hearing the information. Or number 4, indirect exposure to aversive details of the trauma, usually in the course of professional duty. So this would be things like first responders, medical personnel, like ER, doctors. Okay, so you can see criterion A has to do with exposure to the triggering event. And there are a multitude of ways in which you can meet that exposure criteria. Some are direct, some are not. Criterion B, again, only one of the following is required to meet the criterion B requirements of PTSD. The traumatic event is persistently re-experienced. This is that reliving portion I mentioned on the prior video. In one of the following ways, at least. Now, many people with PTSD will experience more than one of these, but you only need to meet one of these criteria in the B section to satisfy it. Intrusive thoughts, I already explained what those are. Those are during conscious waking states. They keep flooding your consciousness related to the event. Nightmares, we talked about that. I explained flashbacks, those dissociative flashbacks. Emotional distress after exposure to any reminders of the trauma, or physical reactivity after exposure to traumatic reminders. Physical reactivity refers to things like your fight or flight physiology. Heart rate increase, blood pressure increase, breathing becomes shallow. Okay, again, most people with PTSD will experience multiple ones of these in criterion B, but you only have to meet one. Let's move on to C. Again, one required, avoidance. This is that avoidance piece I mentioned on the prior video. Avoidance of trauma-related stimuli after the traumatic event in one at least of the following ways. You avoid thoughts or feelings associated with the trauma, or you avoid any trauma-related reminders. Those can be actual stimuli in the environment, or it could be specific people. Again, most people with PTSD will actually experience both of these, but you only need one to meet the criterion of C category for this diagnosis. Fine, let's go on to D. 2 required in criterion D. Negative thoughts or feelings that began, so they did not pre-exist the trauma, that began or worsened after the trauma in the following way. Again, you only need 2, but there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you only need 2 out of these 7 to meet the criterion D section. Inability to recall key features of the trauma, meaning you're actually having memory blockage of aspects of the trauma. Overly negative thoughts and assumptions about yourself or the world as a result of some catastrophic thinking. Exaggerated blame of yourself or other people for causing the trauma. Sometimes people experience extreme guilt because they believe in some way they're at fault for experiencing the traumatic event. Negative affect, so just general dysphoria, saddened mood, extreme anxiety, hopelessness, things like that. Decreased interest in activities, meaning activities that you ordinarily find very joyful and love to do. Like if you're a musician, you don't love to play your instrument anymore. If you like sports, you don't want to be involved in that anymore. Next, feeling isolated, meaning like you feel like you're isolated from other people. You feel like you're withdrawn from other people. You feel like you're not a part of other people. And finally, difficulty experiencing positive affect. That's not the same as experiencing negative affect. Negative affect means you're actually having negative thoughts and feelings, right? You're having depression, you're having anxiety, you feel joyless. Difficulty experiencing positive affect means you have an absence of happiness, joy. You're not excited, you can't experience excitation, right? Now, again, people with PTSD usually experience more than one of these, more than two of these, more than three of these. Some experience all seven. But for diagnosis, you only need any two in category D. Next, E, again, only two required. Trauma-related arousal and reactivity that, again, began with the trauma. This did not pre-exist the trauma or worsened after the trauma. Again, this has to do with that hypervigilance, that exadded, that is not a word. Let's try this again. Take two. It has to do with that exaggerated startle response, that heightened attention to potential cues to threat. There are 6. There are 6 potential ways somebody could demonstrate this. Again, they only need 2 to meet the criteria for diagnosis. In irritability or aggression, I mentioned this on the last video, very easily brought to anger, very irritated at everyday things that don't normally or wouldn't have normally made them so. Risky or destructive behavior. Suddenly this person is now engaging since the trauma in behaviors that put themselves or other people at risk. Hypervigilance, I already explained what that is on the prior video. That's that over-attentiveness to potential threat cues in the environment. Heightened startle reaction, I mentioned that on the last video. You're easily startled in situations that you normally wouldn't be. Difficulty concentrating is self-explanatory. And again, like I said on the last video, difficulty sleeping. Criterion F is something I mentioned on the prior video, the time frame. It has to be longer than a month that these various A through E criteria have been experienced. Less than a month is called acute distress disorder. Criterion G, the symptoms in A through E that the person is experiencing create distress or dysfunction or functional impairment. That means you're having social issues in your relationships, you're having problems at work, things like that, or distress, you feel subjectively upset about your symptoms, tortured. Criterion H, finally, symptoms cannot be explained by medications that you're on for other disorders, substance abuse problems, or other illnesses. Okay, so those are the specific diagnostic criteria for PTSD. Now, let's talk about the specifiers before we move on. Dissociative specification and delayed specification. Now, you know what dissociative means because I spent a lot of time on the prior slide talking about dissociative reactions. So, in addition to meeting the criteria for PTSD diagnosis in A through E criteria that we just went through, dissociative specification would be given to people who are experiencing high levels of either of the following reactions to trauma-related stimuli: depersonalization or derealization, or it could be both. Many experience both. Depersonalization means that a person, like, they know that it's their body and they know that they are themselves. It's not a delusion. They know who they are, they know it's their body, but the perception feels like they're watching themselves from the outside. They'll often say things like, I know it's me, I know I'm me, but I feel robotic. I feel like I'm not really in charge of myself, or I feel like I'm just going through the motions, or I actually feel like an outsider looking in at myself as I go through my day-to-day life. Sometimes they'll say things like, I feel like this isn't happening to me, or it's all a dream. And then derealization is a different type of dissociative reaction where people have a sort of experience of unreality in the environment. So depersonalization has to do with a separation from oneself. Derealization is a separation from one's environment. just feel, and again, it's not a delusion. They know the environment is their environment. They know they're in their house. They know they're in their town. But perceptually, it feels odd. It feels unreal, or they feel like they're kind of like watching from the outside in a bubble. Things feel distorted, but they know they're not, but it's a perception. Another possible specification someone could get with PTSD diagnosis is delayed. That means the full diagnostic criteria are not met until at least 6 months after the trauma. Even though onset of some symptoms might occur immediately, they don't reach diagnostic criteria until at least 6 months. So they might be subclinical for a while, then reach full diagnosis. Again, as I mentioned in the prior video, one of the great controversies about PTSD is not only that some people develop full symptomology immediately after the trauma and others don't, but that in the delayed category, some people develop symptoms within months, others years. Why is that? Why do some people have such a long latency between the traumatic incident and the development of full-blown diagnostic symptoms? We'll talk a little bit about that in a later lecture, but it's highly, 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 highly controversial. Okay, so now meet me on slide 10. I want to talk a little bit about slide 10 and 11, actually. I want to talk a little bit about what some of the changes were from DSM-4 to DSM-5 in how PTSD is diagnosed. First of all, DSM-5 is much more explicit about what counts as a traumatic event. Sexual assault, for example, whether you experience it directly as a victim of it or you witness someone else being sexually assaulted, that counts as a traumatic incident. If you look at slide number 11 for a moment, the exposure to the traumatic event, whether directly or indirectly, has to result from one or more of the following scenarios in which an individual directly experiences the event, witnesses the traumatic event in person, learns the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or close friend, where actual or threatened death was occurring, either violent, purposeful attacks that could have killed somebody or just accidental, like a car crash. It could be vicarious, that the person has exposure to this event watching someone else. It hasn't happened to themselves, or they hear about it but haven't actually watched it. Or 4, the person experiences firsthand repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic event, not through media, not through the news, not through sensationalized documentaries, not through pictures, not through TV or movies. The only time that kind of exposure counts is if it's work related, like if what you do for a living is you're a journalist and you have to review excessive footage of crashes or violence, then it would count. DSM-4 was not as specific as this. DSM-5 is specific in the way in which the individual has to experience the event and whether or not certain types of experiences count, like media versus not, or movies, things like that. Okay, so let's go back to slide 10 for a minute. Another thing that was added to the symptomology in DSM-5 that was not present in DSM-4 is negative thoughts and mood or feelings. So one of the reasons this was added in DSM-5 is that it became clear that a lot of people who experience PTSD have specific negative affect related to the traumatic experience. So it's not just generalized depression. For example, persistent and distorted sense of blame for self or other. Estrangement from others, meaning you feel separated from other people that you used to be attached to. Or a very marked, really a markedly diminished, an extreme change, an extreme lowering of interest in activities that you absolutely used to love before the trauma. Like I said, sports or music or something that you were really passionate about. Or another example is an inability to remember key aspects of the event. This was all added to DSM-5. It was not in DSM-4. Now, there were also things removed in DSM-5 that were present in DSM-4 for diagnosis of PTSD. One was, it is no longer required that a person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. And the reason that was removed is it did not predict the onset of PTSD symptoms, all the other symptoms, because some people initially react to something horrifying and scary by numbing. And it's a delayed reaction later that they start to feel the fear and the hopelessness and the horror. It was not predictive of PTSD symptom onset, whether or not the person experienced the actual event that triggered PTSD with feelings of intense fear or horror or helplessness. That was not predictive. Some people do, some people don't. So that was taken out of the diagnostic nomenclature for DSM-5. And they added 2 new things. There was always delayed onset in the DSM-4, as I explained it in this video. But was not there before in DSM-4, which is in DSM-5, is that dissociative specifier that I explained, where the prominent symptoms the person experiences are detachment from self or environment, that depersonalization and derealization. And preschool, now this is highly controversial. There's actually a specifier for diagnosis in DSM-5 for preschool forms of PTSD, which is defined as those A through E diagnostic symptoms being met by children younger than 6. By children younger than 6. You can think about why that would be controversial. Think about for a moment what some of the reasons would be as to why it might be controversial to try to diagnose PTSD as you now understand it, as you now understand all the required symptoms in someone younger than 6. In someone younger than 6. Okay. So before I end this video, I would like you to take a look at slide number 12, PTSD, the War Within. And there is a link that I want you to start watching at 3 minutes, 1 second. I know that's very specific, 3 minutes, 1 second. This gives you a really good idea about how PTSD symptoms manifest. Now, a very large group of people with PTSD come from military. They're not the only type of PTSD that we see, but especially people who've been in military combat for extended periods of time. We often see the development of PTSD symptoms. So now that you know what the symptoms are, sort of definition-wise, I want you to listen to the individuals who are being interviewed and explaining their experience of PTSD on this documentary to get an idea of how these symptoms actually manifest in individuals who experience them. Okay, I will be back. See you soon.